Shaq was cruising through the city when he spotted a kid, alone in the rain, drenched and shaking. People walked past, ignoring him. But Shaq? He wasn't about to do the same. What happened next spiraled into a shocking encounter with the mob, an FBI sting operation, and a takedown that made headlines worldwide. By the time it was over, a crime boss was behind bars, the internet exploded, and Shaq was being hailed as a real-life superhero. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. It was past midnight, the streets quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. Rain drizzled down in thin, steady sheets, turning the city lights into blurred streaks of neon against the wet pavement. Shaq had been driving home after a late-night gym session, the low thrum of music in his car filling the silence, until something caught his eye. At a deserted bus stop, a small figure sat hunched over, arms wrapped around his knees, his shoulders trembling. The kid had no jacket, no umbrella, just a worn-out backpack slumped beside him, its fabric darkened by the rain. His hair clung to his forehead, and even from inside the car, Shaq could see his red, swollen eyes. Shaq's grip on the wheel tightened. People were walking past him. A couple hurried by, barely sparing him a glance. A businessman in a trench coat took a quick look and then turned away, pretending not to see. Shaq's jaw tensed. Not today. Without a second thought, he swung his car to the curb, the tires splashing against the soaked pavement. The windshield wipers thumped in rhythm, the only sound as he put the car in park. The kid didn't even look up. Shaq stepped out, the rain immediately soaking into the fabric of his hoodie. His massive frame cast a shadow over the tiny bus stop. For the first time in a long time, he felt small standing next to someone. He crouched down, lowering himself to the kid's level. "Yo, lil man, what's wrong?" The boy flinched at the sound of his voice, his breath hitching. Up close, Shaq could see the way his fingers dug into his soaked jeans, his knuckles white. The kid didn't answer. Shaq's voice softened. "Where's your parents?" The boy finally looked up, his eyes hollow and distant, his lips trembling. His response was barely a whisper, but it hit Shaq like a punch to the gut. "I don't have any." The words hit Shaq like a freight train. For a second, all he could do was stare. The kid's voice had been barely above a whisper, but the weight behind it was crushing. The rain continued to fall around them, drumming softly against the metal bus stop, but everything else seemed to fade into silence. Shaq's expression hardened. "What do you mean you don't have any?" The boy sniffled, wiping his soaked sleeve across his nose. He still wouldn't look Shaq in the eye. "They left me." His voice was small, but the hurt in it was massive. "I have nowhere to go." Shaq's hands curled into fists, his knuckles tightening. Who just leaves their kid? He glanced around, scanning the empty street. No cops, no social workers, no one. Just a soaking wet child in a city that didn't care enough to stop. Shaq exhaled sharply, trying to keep his anger in check. "How long you been out here?" The boy swallowed hard, hugging his knees closer to his chest. 2 days. Shaq felt something twist in his gut. 2 whole days out in the cold, with no food, no shelter, and no one willing to help. The kid's small frame shuddered again, but this time, Shaq wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. His shoulders tensed, his fingers gripping his backpack tighter. Shaq noticed the shift immediately. "What is it?" The boy hesitated. His lips parted, but no sound came out at first. His eyes darted toward the darkened street behind them, barely visible through the falling rain. Finally, his voice came, soft and shaky. "I think someone is following me." Shaq's entire body stiffened. He didn't blink, didn't move. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the dimly lit street. And that's when he saw it. A dark figure, standing perfectly still near a lamppost across the road, watching. Shaq's entire body tensed, a deep instinct kicking in. They were being watched. Years of experience had taught him how to sense danger before it struck, and right now every fiber of his being told him something wasn't right. He didn't react immediately, didn't turn his head too quickly. Instead, he let his gaze move subtly, scanning the area with the kind of awareness that had nothing to do with basketball and everything to do with survival. Across the street, standing near a flickering lamppost, was a figure barely visible in the dim light. They weren't moving, weren't shifting their weight from one foot to the other like a normal pedestrian waiting for a cab. They just stood there, still as a statue, positioned just far enough away that their face was hidden in shadow. But Shaq could feel it. the unmistakable weight of their stare. Beside him, the boy seemed to sense the shift in Shaq's posture. He followed Shaq's gaze, his breath catching, the moment he saw what had caught Shaq's attention. His fingers clenched around the straps of his backpack, his entire body going rigid. "You see him, don't you?" His voice was barely more than a whisper, but the fear in it was enough to confirm what Shaq already suspected. He kept his tone level, calm, but firm enough to leave no room for argument. "Get in the car, kid. Now." The boy hesitated, glancing between Shaq and the figure across the street, uncertainty flashing in his rain-streaked eyes. His instincts told him to run, but something about Shaq's steady presence anchored him in place. "But," Shaq's voice dropped lower, carrying a quiet authority that left no room for hesitation. "I got you. Now move." The boy's hesitation melted into pure urgency. He scrambled to his feet, his soaked sneakers slipping slightly against the pavement as he rushed toward the car. His small hands fumbled with the door handle before yanking it open and throwing himself inside. The second the door slammed shut, Shaq saw it. The figure moved, not toward them, but away. A slow step backward, then another. Then in one smooth motion, the figure turned and disappeared into the alley, swallowed by darkness. Shaq sat still for a moment, watching the spot where the figure had been, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth ached. Everything about this felt wrong. He slid into the driver's seat, shaking off the rain as he adjusted his grip on the wheel. Beside him, the boy sat curled up in the passenger seat, his knees pulled to his chest, his breathing uneven. The windshield wipers moved back and forth, a rhythmic beat against the tense silence. Shaq exhaled, slow and deliberate, trying to process everything that had just happened. Finally, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. "Ain't no way I'm letting this go." Shaq wasn't about to drop a scared kid off at some overcrowded shelter, where he'd just end up another name on a clipboard, forgotten by morning. He had a better idea. The city streets blurred past as he drove, the rain still tapping steadily against the windshield. Beside him, the kid sat silent, curled up in the passenger seat, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Shaq glanced over. "You hungry?" The boy hesitated before giving a small nod. Shaq didn't say anything else. He just turned onto a quiet side street, pulling into the parking lot of a small 24-hour diner. Neon lights buzzed above the entrance, casting a soft glow against the rain-soaked pavement. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, safe. They stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and frying bacon wrapping around them like a blanket. The waitress barely glanced up. Late-night stragglers weren't unusual here. Shaq guided the boy to a booth in the corner, away from the windows, where the kid could sit with his back against the cushioned seat. A steaming plate of pancakes landed in front of him minutes later. The boy stared at it for a second, almost like he didn't trust it, then picked up his fork and started eating. Not fast, not desperate, just methodical, like someone who had learned to ration food because he never knew when his next meal would come. Shaq didn't rush him. He just watched, noting the way the boy's eyes flicked toward the door every few minutes, checking the entrance like he expected someone to burst in at any second. The tension in his small shoulders never fully disappeared. Finally, Shaq leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was low but steady. "All right, kid, tell me everything." Danny's hands shook as he finally spoke the words Shaq wasn't expecting. For the past few minutes, the kid had been pushing his food around his plate, barely eating. His eyes darted toward the door every few seconds, his posture tense like he was ready to run at any moment. Shaq had seen that kind of fear before, not just in kids, but in grown men who knew they were in deep trouble. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Talk to me, kid. What happened?" Danny swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his fork. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then finally, in a voice so low Shaq had to strain to hear it, he said, "They didn't leave me. They were running." Shaq's brows furrowed. "Running from who?" Danny exhaled shakily, staring down at his plate. "Bad people." Shaq didn't interrupt. He let the kid take his time. Danny's shoulders slumped as he continued. "My parents, they owed money. A lot of it. And when they couldn't pay, He hesitated, his breath hitching before he forced the next words out. "They disappeared." Shaq's expression darkened. "So they left you behind?" Danny nodded, his throat bobbing as he tried to hold back the emotion rising inside him. "They didn't mean to," he added quickly, as if that made it better. "They thought if they ran, maybe these guys would stop looking for us. But they didn't. Shaq sat back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't easily rattled, but this was messed up. A kid left defenseless, with dangerous people still looking for him. His jaw tightened. "Who's after you, kid?" Danny hesitated again, glancing around the diner as if saying the name out loud might summon something dark from the shadows. His fingers clutched his fork so tight his knuckles turned white. Finally, in a barely audible whisper, he breathed out the name, Luca Valerio. Shaq's entire body went still. His eyes narrowed. He knew that name, and it wasn't good. The second Shaq heard the name, his stomach dropped. Luca Valerio. That wasn't just a name, it was a warning. Shaq had heard of him before. A loan shark with deep mob ties. The kind of guy who didn't just make people disappear. He made them vanish like they never existed. If someone owed Luca money and didn't pay up, their life turned into a ticking time bomb. He wasn't just ruthless. He was calculated, patient, and relentless. And now, he was after this kid. Shaq exhaled, rubbing his temples as he tried to process what Danny had just told him. "You're telling me a mobster is looking for you?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Concern, frustration, something else. Danny gave a small, shaky nod. His fingers twisted into the sleeves of his too-thin hoodie, like he was trying to disappear into it. "He thinks my parents have money." His voice was barely above a whisper, like he was afraid even speaking Luca's name would summon him. "But they don't. And now he's looking for me." Shaq leaned back in the booth, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He had dealt with a lot of things in his lifetime, entitled rich folks, fake friends, people trying to use him for his money. But this was a whole different level. He stole a glance around the diner, scanning the late-night crowd. A trucker was sipping coffee at the counter. A waitress leaned against the kitchen door, scribbling down an order. Nobody seemed to be paying them any mind, for now. But Shaq knew better than to assume they were safe. If Luca wanted the kid, his men were probably already looking. He drummed his fingers on the table, exhaling sharply. "All right, kid." His voice was firm now, like he had just made a decision. Change of plans. Danny blinked up at him, confusion flickering through his tired eyes. "What do you mean?" Shaq slid out of the booth, tossing a few bills on the table. "I mean, you're sticking with me, because there's no way in hell I'm letting some mobster get to you first." Shaq had been around long enough to know one thing. When you don't have all the answers, you call someone who does. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with a sense of urgency. This wasn't a situation he could handle alone. If Luca Valerio was involved, this was bigger than just a kid on the run. This was dangerous. Danny watched him carefully, his eyes still filled with uncertainty. "Who are you calling?" he asked, his voice small but laced with curiosity. Shaq didn't answer right away. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the one name he knew could help. Mark Holloway, ex-FBI. The kind of guy who didn't just know things. He knew things before they even happened. Shaq pressed the call button and put the phone to his ear. The line rang twice before a deep, no-nonsense voice answered. "Didn't expect to hear from you, big man." "What's up?" Shaq cut straight to the point. "I need intel on Luca Valerio. Fast." There was a pause. Not the kind where someone is confused, but the kind where someone is deciding how much to say. When Holloway finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more serious. "If he's after the kid, this is bad." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened. That wasn't the answer he wanted. "How bad?" Holloway let out a slow breath. "The kind of bad where people don't just disappear. They get erased. If this kid's on his radar, it means Luca thinks he's worth something, and that means he's not going to stop." Shaq's jaw clenched. He glanced over at Danny, who was still sitting across the booth, fiddling with his napkin, completely unaware that his life had just become even more complicated. Shaq exhaled through his nose, his mind racing. This wasn't just a favor anymore. This was personal. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket before muttering under his breath, "Looks like I just got involved in something big." Shaq wasn't just going to protect Danny. He was going to end this threat for good. Sitting back in the diner booth, he stared out the rain-streaked window, his mind already working 3 steps ahead. Luca Valerio wasn't the kind of man you ran from forever. If he wanted Danny, he'd keep coming until he got what he was after. Or someone stopped him. And Shaq had just decided he was that someone. His phone buzzed in his palm. It was Mark Holloway, his FBI contact, calling back faster than expected. Shaq answered immediately. "Tell me you got something." "I got more than something," Holloway replied, his voice clipped. Luca's men have been sniffing around the city for days. They think the kid is still out there alone. They're desperate to find him before the wrong people realize they let his parents slip through their fingers. Shaq's jaw tightened. So we make them come to us. A pause. Then Holloway let out a low chuckle. That what you're thinking? Damn right. Shaq laid out his plan. Set up a meeting, make it seem like Danny was being handed over, and let Luca walk right into a trap. The key? A public place. Somewhere crowded where Luca wouldn't risk pulling something stupid. And more importantly, somewhere the feds could be waiting. Holloway didn't hesitate. I can have a team in place in 2 hours. We'll sit back, let Luca think he's winning, and then take him down before he even knows what hit him. Shaq glanced over at Danny, who was staring at him with wide eyes, still clutching his backpack like a lifeline. You trust me, kid? Shaq asked. Danny swallowed hard, then nodded. Yeah. Shaq turned back to the phone. Then let's finish this. As he hung up, he flexed his fingers, feeling the tension settle into his bones. He wasn't just stepping into a fight. He was making sure this one ended for good. Luca Valerio walked in, smug. He had no idea what was waiting for him. The restaurant was busy, just like Shaq had planned. A popular steakhouse on the edge of the city, packed with tourists and late-night diners. It was the kind of place where no one would suspect a meeting was actually a setup. Luca entered like he owned the room, flanked by 2 men in dark suits, both built like professional bouncers. He was in his early 50s, slicked back salt and pepper hair, an expensive tailored suit that screamed money, and a wristwatch that probably cost more than most people's rent. But it wasn't just the wealth, it was the confidence. Luca had the air of a man who had never been told no, who always got what he wanted. And tonight, he thought what he wanted was Danny. Shaq, seated in a back booth, kept his expression neutral as he watched Luca scan the room. The mobster's gaze landed on a lone figure sitting at a corner table. Danny, hoodie up, backpack on his lap, eyes locked on the table. Luca smirked, muttering something to one of his men before striding forward. Shaq's hands tightened into fists under the table. He didn't like using the kid as bait, but Holloway's team was already in position. Agents in plain clothes seated at nearby tables, an unmarked van parked outside, snipers on the rooftops. Luca had no idea he was walking into a cage. Luca reached Danny's table, his smile sharp. Well, well, kid. You've had quite the adventure. His voice was smooth, practiced, like he was speaking to an old friend. Let's go. You and I have business to settle. Danny's hands clenched his backpack straps, his knuckles turning white. Then, it happened. A dozen figures moved at once. FBI agents rose from their seats, badges flashing. Doors swung open as more stormed in from outside. Shouts filled the restaurant. Luca's men reached for their guns, but they never got the chance. Within seconds, they were shoved against tables, arms twisted behind their backs as cuffs snapped into place. Luca barely had time to react before 2 agents grabbed him, slamming him onto the table. His face twisted in rage as he struggled, his cocky demeanor shattered. Then he spotted Shaq, standing tall with arms crossed. Luca snarled. You set me up. Shaq smirked. You messed with the wrong kid. For the first time in days, Danny could finally breathe. The restaurant was still buzzing with the aftermath of the takedown. FBI agents hauled Luca Valerio and his men toward the exit, their wrists locked in steel cuffs. A few customers whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened, while others stared at Shaq like he had just pulled off some action movie stunt. But for Danny, none of that mattered. He sat frozen in his chair, his small chest rising and falling as he tried to process everything. The constant weight of fear, the kind that had kept him looking over his shoulder, the kind that had made sleep impossible, was suddenly gone. Luca wasn't coming for him anymore. No more running, no more hiding. Shaq pulled out his phone and stepped away from the chaos, dialing a number with practiced ease. Danny watched him closely. Was this it? Would Shaq just leave now that the danger was gone? A part of him expected it. That's how things usually worked, right? People helped for a moment, but then life moved on. Shaq's deep voice was steady as he spoke into the phone. Yeah, he's safe. It's handled. He listened for a second, then nodded. They ready? Another pause. Good, I'll bring him. When he finally put his phone away, he turned to Danny, his expression unreadable. Come on, kid. Let's go. Danny hesitated. Where? Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up Danny's backpack and handed it to him. Someplace better. Danny slowly slung the bag over his shoulder, his fingers tightening around the straps. He wasn't sure why, but there was something different about Shaq. Something that made him believe this wasn't just another temporary fix. Still, he had to ask. He had to know. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Danny finally turned to Shaq, his voice quiet but filled with something raw, something real. "Why did you help me?" Shaq put a hand on the kid's shoulder. His grip was firm but warm, steadying Danny as if to remind him that he wasn't alone anymore. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it." Danny stared up at him, his tired eyes searching Shaq's face for something. Doubt, hesitation, an empty promise. But all he found was certainty. For the first time in a long while, he believed it. They stood outside the restaurant, the night air cool against Danny's skin. The tension that had been gripping his chest for days had loosened, like he could finally take a full breath without the weight of fear pressing down on him. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Danny. "That's the address of the family I told you about. Good people. They've been waiting for you." Danny took the paper, his fingers brushing against the creases. It felt surreal. Just days ago, he had no one. Now there was a family, a real family, waiting for him. "You sure about this?" Danny's voice was small, uncertain. Shaq crouched down so they were eye level. "I wouldn't leave you if I wasn't." He smirked, giving Danny's shoulder a light squeeze. "And don't think I'm just dropping you off and forgetting about you. I'll be checking in regularly." Danny let out a breathy laugh, something light and real. He nodded, gripping his backpack strap like an anchor. And then he did something unexpected. He threw his arms around Shaq, squeezing him tightly. For a moment, Shaq just stood there, surprised. Then slowly, he wrapped his arms around the kid, holding him in a way that said, "You're safe now." When they finally pulled apart, Shaq ruffled Danny's hair and gave him a final nod before stepping into his car. As he pulled onto the road, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His story had just gone viral. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to change everything. Shaq sat in his car, the low hum of the engine filling the quiet night. The city lights flickered across the wet pavement as he drove, the events of the past few days playing in his mind like a highlight reel. From the moment he had seen Danny sitting alone in the rain to the takedown of Luca Valerio, it still felt unreal how much had changed in such a short amount of time. His phone buzzed again. Another notification, then another. He glanced at the screen at a red light, his eyebrows raising slightly. His name was everywhere. Shaq the Hero was trending. News articles, video clips, and social media posts flooded his feed. Someone had recorded the takedown at the restaurant, and now it had millions of views. People were calling him a real-life superhero. NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal just did something unbelievable. A billionaire athlete takes justice into his own hands. This is how you use power the right way. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear size 22 shoes. Shaq exhaled a small chuckle, shaking his head. The internet was wild. He didn't do it for attention. He didn't do it for clicks or praise. He did it because when he saw a kid in trouble, he knew what had to be done. His thoughts drifted back to Danny. The way the kid had hugged him before leaving. The way his face had finally lost that haunted look after realizing he wasn't alone anymore. Shaq had seen a lot in his lifetime. Championship rings, fame, fortune. But that moment, that meant more than any trophy ever could. His phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't another news notification. It was a message from Danny. "Made it. They're really nice. Thanks for everything." Shaq smiled, tapping out a quick reply. "Told you, lil man. Good people always win." Then as the light turned green, he set the phone aside, gripping the wheel with one hand. "Just another day, man."